All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. It's the Dev Talk Show on October 18th of 2024. And I'm here with Rich Ross. How you doing this morning, Rich?
Morning, Chris. Doing well. Doing well. Up and ready
Good,
for a
good.
show. This is great.
Yeah, and it's a Friday, so that's good.
Yes.
Although it's taken me most of the last couple of days to figure out what day of the week it is, but I'm pretty sure that
And
it
that was
is
all about a
actually
holiday
Friday.
too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's been a busy week for me. Just a lot of activities going on, and so I actually did um, do school drop off and say to myself, "Oh my gosh, it's Friday today." So
It is a
here
good
we are.
thing.
We are.
Yes.
That's I love the background there. That's pretty cool. Is it now?
Oh,
My first is it AI generated? That's my first question.
I do not know. And that's
Yeah,
not
maybe.
that's okay. That's my typical work background. So
Oh,
thank
I
you for pulling
see.
that out. So, what's the one? We could do London. Wait a minute. London? There you
Oh,
go. We
yeah.
got London, or what's the one we typically use? There we go. Tech Ready.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So, yep,
So that
we are
was,
here.
so
Go
that
ahead.
is some of the new Innovation Hub uh, logos that we have. So I'll have to ask that was computer generated because it's actually a video where all those little chiclet things kind of move. So it's pretty cool.
Is that uh Seattle where that background is?
This
Because
one?
I remember seeing images from it might have been tech. It might have been I was about to call it tech ed. It might have been Ignite. It might have been Build, where one of the convention centers that Microsoft has been at in the past has those escalators that kind of like
Yeah.
they're kind of like right smack in the middle, and they feel very I don't know. When I was watching them, I kind of had the little bit of the vertigo feeling because I get in high places I get really like jittery, and I said I don't know if I'd be able to go up that escalator that easily. I mean, I'm sure I'd be fine, but
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah.
just it looks like that building. So
Yeah. This is I think it's the Washington State Convention Center.
okay,
I think
yeah,
that's what they called this one. Um, and I believe some of the more recent ones have been in a slightly different location nearby, but just another couple of buildings away. This was from the very top, looking out over with a 360-degree camera. So that's why it's got the weird curves of the um, as you flatten it out into one image. So that's why I thought it was
yeah,
an interesting shot.
yeah. My background is not AI generated, but
See, what I have
I
to do
mean,
is I have to get a picture of the background I have in the office because that's got the robots and the Legos and that. And
yeah.
this way, it's just wherever I am.
I've I mean I've used the green screen in the past, even on this show, and I just haven't had it up in a very long time. And one time, just a quick story is at work is somebody went to the trouble of setting up a green screen, but they took video very much like Speed, which of course is a very old movie these days. They took video of the background, and they had a long video, and I don't know how they did it. I mean, maybe they looped it for a long time or whatever, but they did it long enough that
Mm-hmm.
they had a scene that they filmed that it didn't come up enough to where if you blinked, you might have missed it. And if you caught it, you went, oh, that was really clever. There was a scene where the very same person in the meeting came in the room and put down like a new cup of coffee for him and took the old one away. And as they were winning
Oh
away,
wow,
they turn to the camera and they go like they like complain. They do a gesture and then walk out. And it was so
nice.
subtle. It was so subtle, but it was a very neat little gag.
Yeah, I don't.
So
Was that around like during the pandemic? Because I feel people who are
it was
very
during there.
creative.
Yeah. Yeah. It was
Yeah,
definitely then. Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
We had one where something similar where a guy had a loop behind him, and it looked just like you. He was in a room, but there was a door, and every so many minutes he would come in through the door
Yeah.
and go out through another door.
Yep. Yep. That's what it was. Is he himself came in and changed the cups of coffee, so it obviously wasn't really it. And he would like gesture like this person's not even grateful. That's kind of how it felt.
Right.
It was really funny.
Didn't even recognize me.
Yeah. So here we are today
Cool.
talking again about talking about software development and doing something a little different for the show. If you've been watching us for a while, um, we have been talking for a long time about we've done a lot of exploring of ASP.NET Core and Blazor on the show. And some people have even asked in the comments, like, hey, it'd be cool if you built an app, right? And we've said the same thing. We said, yeah, that would be pretty cool. So the best way to get started with building an app is not what we have been showing off on this show a lot, which is a file, new project, and explore the program CS file. It's actually to plan a little bit. So, at least plan enough. And maybe that's a new concept for a lot of us.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Sometimes, hey, let's just get to the code, right?
Right. Well, that's the thing that's the instinct for a lot of us as developers, is that you're more comfortable just kind of seeing what you can do. Because otherwise it can feel, at least to me, and they'll be interested in what you think and what people think that are watching the show. Let us know what you think. It can feel to me like you are designing something, and I don't, designing like something in the air. I was going to say like designing something in the clouds, but that has a meaning now in computers,
right,
in computer science. But somebody once said that software architecture is like designing air castles.
Okay.
You're thinking about what you want, but you can't even tangibly really look at it yet. Certainly that might be why we as developers feel comfortable saying, well, let me bang out a few things. And even if you're disciplined enough to say this will be a proof of concept, but the next thing you know, the proof of concept looks like it's kind of good and it gets shipped, and that's not your proof of concept anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's both of those things you mentioned are some slippery slopes that I run into in talking to customers, right? We've got even recently someone coming along and saying, hey, we want to get right to prototype. I'm like, well, we haven't really talked through a design yet. And for us, we want at least some kind of a rough sketch design of the pieces we want to include and how we think they might, what goes where and what might be talking to each other, even before we get to the prototype step. Because otherwise you're at the prototype step. It's like, oh yeah, we forgot about this. How do we do it? Now you're pulling stuff apart. So we hit that first one a lot. And then the second one, about being able to, what was your second one? Oh no.
Oh, well, partially that it goes to production, but the other is, yeah.
That's the one. That's like it's a prototype, right? It's,
sure.
Not throwaway, but it could be, and nobody would be too sad, right? That's that kind of a thing.
Yeah. I actually know somebody in the industry who I've worked with before at previous places, who has more than once said that if he could, in fact, maybe he's even tried it in certain positions that he's worked in, I don't know for sure, that he would prefer to prototype an application in a language / platform other than the one that the team is going to use, and it's on purpose.
Sure.
The idea being that, well, we're going to throw it away because maybe nobody else on the team knows that. Maybe, I'll just make something up. Maybe nobody knows Python. Maybe it's a .NET shop, right? Or the other way around.
Yeah.
Or anything.
Yeah.
And so it's, well, I'm going to do it a little bit in Python. And then that way, when the company's all in on something, on some other technology, we're not going to use it. And I wonder how many times that's actually backfired, right? Where they just go like, nope, set up a server.
Yeah. We're going to go hire a bunch of Python developers now.
Now put out some Rex. Yeah, I hear you. So, but it's an interesting thought process. And I think we have tools more than ever that, especially when you consider things like Power Platform or Power Automate, or even look at some of the stuff we have in the cloud, like Logic Apps, where the line is blurring. It doesn't mean it's bad, where it's like, well, let me just kind of draw what I want. And it's like, oh, okay, well, there it is. So, but that's not what we're doing here. At least I don't think so. I guess we haven't looked yet. We don't know. So I think you have a whiteboard app available, right?
I do. Just to kind of, if you want to go ahead and share that, you should be able to see what we've got.
Yep.
I might have to add it back to the stage because I pulled it off. There you go.
There it goes. Good.
So this is, the good news is that this is just whiteboard available from the Microsoft Store. So you can download it and do the same thing. It's a free app. And if you're having some kind of a tablet device, you can also maybe, there we go.
Yep. So drawing works. I've used this.
Yep.
In fact, I think I've even maybe used it once on the show, but I've used it also where It's nice you can invite other people to it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And maybe, at least for right now, maybe what we want to do, not with black ink, but with white ink, is to, hey, let's just talk through what we want, maybe some of the things that we want our application to do, right? What are the features, the functionalities, and then use that to say, well, given all these things we want it to do, what are the, the services or the things that we might want to go ahead and connect into, right?
Right. Right.
And the background of this is we talked about a little bit on the show on Wednesday, but basically we want to use Blazor, try out all the new features in .NET 9, and be able to build an app that let's say a user group, when they're scheduling their monthly meetings, it's a place where they can say, well, this is the meeting that we're going to have, and people can become members of that group and essentially sign up and say, hey, I'm going to attend this one. So we've got a couple of, those are some of the initial features that we think we want to include around that. So I'm sorry, you're going to ask something, Chris. Maybe not.
Not necessarily. I do think that, yeah, I was kind of gathering my head, like, what are the things that we want it to do? And for one thing, it could theoretically serve as the user group's website, maybe. Like, it very well could be enough that when you come to the user group site, that it's pretty much just drops you in as, hey, here's the next event. Or it could be the homepage could be like slightly a step back, but then you head to the event. So part of it, I don't know if that's really just to say that this may not necessarily just be like some offshoot app where it may really take the place of the user group site. So
right. It may or may not. I know when you think about Philly.net, that's kind of how they're using their current tool for doing this, right? They don't have a public facing website anymore. So this could be that landing space for them, but it just could be also a place where they link to and say, hey, this is where the events are. So yeah, totally. So we'll have, maybe something where we have an easy way of putting the information about the group. So some kind of a landing page where we can get the specifics. Sorry, still waking up with the coffee here. No. And then events. And then I think we also need to have some kind of information about, sorry, move the mouse out of the way here. The members or the attendees, right?
Yeah, you mentioned a little earlier that people would sign up to go, and that does make sense because there is a limit to the capacity, number one. And then I think maybe the second part of that is, are we talking about registering them somehow so that, well, you get a lot of things out of that. Number one is convenience coming back, is that, I don't have to provide my information again. At least you might not have to find your information again. But it also helps the organizers. And it helps in two ways. The organizers know how many people are coming, and now you you're building a contact list that you might be able to use to notify these people outside of relying on them showing up to the site every so often.
Yep, good point. So having something around notifications. Something around signing up, right? So we've got to have some kind of a, not only register for the events, but register for the application itself.
Right.
And on the event side, so we need attendees to register events, but even probably more, we need to do all the CRUD stuff related to events, right? We need to create, update, delete, create, read, update, delete an event that gets that's in our system. So some space for the guys who run the group to be able to say, okay, let's go ahead and set something up for this particular date.
Right. And so breaking down what an event is that part of this where we say, there's a date, time, a location?
Yeah, definitely. So we think about the second. Boop. Boop. So we need date time. And this, this is, I mean, some of it is, what we have for the model, and maybe, we capture that here, but we also could wait and capture that a little bit as we start to pseudocode out what it is that we're writing to, right? But we know we need a date time. We know we need probably the title.
Yep.
Description.
Usually there's description, yeah. And then
speaker.
Yeah, we could I mean, theoretically, that could just be written in the description. But yes, we could also say, because I think a lot of tools do this, is where you actually, the speaker is a person or can be an attendee in the group, and you can click on them and it automatically brings in, all their information. I think there's some apps that do that. I don't know. But let's see. What this is also kind of leading to is that we talked about members signing up. So now we're already getting into authorization, where some people that have signed up for this site are authorized to deal with the events. Or just to deal, we're eventually going to probably come up with multiple roles, but somebody is able to create, manage these things, and other people just view them.
So maybe it's more, hey, what are the roles? And we're going to need some kind of authorized, and whatever the functions are for the authorized users. There should be those who are just authenticated, right? So I just have, signed into the app, right? So
yep.
That's all I am. I'm Joe user. I'm signed in so that specifically who I am. So when I sign up for an event, I can capture that. And then what are the, is there an unauthenticated view, or what that looks like, right? Because you need to kind of progress through that process. Think of the Blazor app that we looked at on Wednesday, right? There's those first couple of tabs on there around the, the counter and the weather and the homepage. Those are all unauthenticated views. But when I want to go ahead and look at the authenticated views, or the authorized view, I now have to go ahead and sign in. So it's that same kind of paradigm. It's just where we get into this app that we're trying to create.
Right. Now, so we've talked about events. Is this also where we talk about different views, like a calendar-based view versus an individual view?
We can certainly do that. Much like we have the roles. I mean, those are things that we can include. So this becomes almost like the pages we want to include in the app. So this is, what did you say, calendar view?
Yeah. Where
what was the other?
Where you see the list of things that are happening, versus now I'm drilling into the specific thing that's coming up, or.
Yep. Yeah. So, yep, absolutely. I think so. When we think, or in my mind, as I look at this list, and I'll, kind of, so can I scroll back out a little bit so we can kind of see more of the list? Come on. Well, let me do it with you. I grab the hand, do this. There we go. Okay. When we think about the list of what we have here, and maybe this is no, it's probably not sliced into. So think about what we've got when we think about when we talk about events, we talk about an information page, we talk about members and attendees. Those things are pieces of the application that are functionality. And when we think about, I'm just going to try and move this up here to, oops. You're going to make me cut and paste, aren't you? All right.
I think you can lasso it and move it, right?
Well, it's in a text box. Otherwise, I would be able to. Yes. So this whole box makes it a little strange. So I guess here's what I'm when we say this is kind of how I think about it. Events, information for the group, admin, members pages, those are features, functionality that we want the app to have. I think these are also a bit of functionality, but they're more, it's a different type of requirement. And that members didn't move. Wow, that was interesting. All right, sorry. Try that again. Cut that. Back up to here. All right, that's better. Okay. Yeah, so there's certainly requirements. I think of them like in a little bit of a different scope, right? Because those are things that even then the user roles are going to be a little bit of kind of related to what I'm trying to as we start to have the conversation, what I'm trying to parse through is we're going to take what we have here that we want to include and say, okay, how does this translate into architecture components, right? Things that we know that we're going to need for what we have here. And they're somewhat related, but kind of somewhat not, right? The views are things that we need to think about in the application level as you start to build them out. So whatever framework we're using to put this together, if it wasn't .NET, how might we create those pages? How might we create those views? If it's Angular, React, or whatever,
Right.
versus the authorized roles, those are something that also kind of comes into the framework, but we need to think about it from where we're storing that data, because oftentimes, you think about it's authentication versus authorization, right? They're those two mechanisms. So how are we essentially doing that in our app? So yes, just I got good thinking about them a little differently, right? And how you might solve for them. That's all. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
ask. Yeah, go ahead.
There are probably plenty of other features that we could come up with, and I think we see that a lot of applications start solving by solving like some problem, and then as time goes on, you see like, oh, we've added this new thing. For example, like you mentioned notifications, and so does that mean that we're thinking about how we email them, or even other types of notifications these days? Some people, I think, don't mind. I mean, it just depends on who you are. Might say like, yeah, I don't read emails, but if I got a text message, that would help me. Or if there was a calendar that I could subscribe to on my phone, that would help me. Or, I wonder what other things people might do. Even a push notification might be interesting. That all sounds annoying, I'm sure, to some folks, but then it's the kind of thing where it's annoying when like apps do that maybe without your permission and they do it too often. But if it's something that actually helps you, then you say, oh, that's okay.
Right.
So,
and some people it helps and some people it doesn't. That's why we have the toggle that says notify me or not.
Yeah.
But there might be some things, and this is slicing it in a different way. I think you said with a push notification, right? So I complete my registration, something happens behind the scene, and then the thing says, hey, you're registered, you got accepted or whatever.
Right. Yep.
Awesome.
So we have that. I'm just trying to think of what else needs to be in there like right away. I mean, we could imagine all kinds of features, but when you think about it, you want a place where people can view upcoming events, say that they're coming, and then the organizers can use that to help plan and execute on the event. And then they can also, they can manage them, add new ones, expand the calendar, and so on.
Yep, exactly. So when we think about, and some of this is, so I think this is a good starting point for the application that we want to kind of put together. It gives us, some cool things to look at, some basic data writing, data reading, maybe even caching to some extent, if that becomes, something we want to look at. Ability to do something related to authentication, which is a big thing for us as we talk about Blazor and how that works. Um, I think from a feature set, that's good. I think when we think about the application, how do we want to maybe deploy this application, right? So we get, that's a that's kind of a secondary conversation, right? As a developer, this is kind of what we're focused in. All right, how do I build it? How do I do those things? But at some point, you need to transition from it's no longer got to be on my machine. How do I move this to some other space where others can access it now? Because I'm not going to open a port on my machine the whole time, right? Or
Yeah.
sit it on a box under my desk.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing that this list doesn't specifically say, and maybe that's and I think that's good, is I kept even at the very beginning, I kept talking about website. But
Mm-hmm.
when you think about it, it could also be an ecosystem where you have services and systems that manage the data and maybe even allow well, and then you have your front end, like how do users interact with it? And the website is just one way. There
Yeah.
could also be a mobile app, and that
Mm-hmm.
mobile app gets you into places like the person's it might get you a convenient way for some people to say, well, listen, I'm just going to download the app, I'm going to give it the appropriate permissions, and now it can put it on my calendar on the phone, and it can put and I can tell me when a new meeting was added, a new event was added. And it
Yeah.
can let me sign up right here. And heck, maybe I don't even have to open the application. Maybe I just, oh, the notification, one of the options is to register, and it's just done.
Yeah.
So none of this list says it, which I think is good, but that is the that'll be the expression of this list is how you actually interact with it. Because I kept saying like website, but I go like, well, it doesn't have to just be a website. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mobile's certainly an option, and with hybrid, right? Blazor hybrid, our website could become the mobile very easily, and
yeah,
that might be something interesting to explore too.
right.
Um, so if we think about, so let's put those kind of functional requirements of the application, right? The things it kind of needs to have, and let's talk a little bit about how we might want to, because these are decisions that when you're talking to the business, even at this stage, these are some of the decisions we might be aware of and might want to have the conversation around now. So, what is the place where we think this might get deployed into, or how we might architect this for deployment in, just to complete the
Yeah.
conversation in our on-premises data center, or are we doing this in some kind of a cloud service, right? So what are the pieces that we might need? So let's say that we're going to do this as web. So we're going to need some kind of web front end server service or some, the UI, what we I guess typically think of as the UI components, right? What's
Right.
that end bit that winds up on the user's box?
Right.
Um,
Right. And I mean, I think you said something earlier about it sitting under somebody's desk. That's not what either of us want to do. So
right,
we're definitely looking at services that it's where it's somebody else's machine, frankly.
right.
And 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 it's up 24/7, and it's and we already kind of know how to do some things like point a domain name at it so that and so forth. But I
Yeah.
mean, now are we talking about listing out possible target services, or is it just the fact that we know there's going to be one?
I think right now we know there's going to be one, and I
Okay,
think we need,
that's fine.
and then let's continue down that
Yep,
path. So, what
yep,
might be some of the other services that we
yep.
might need to
Right.
have for our application?
So theoretically, in fact, this
Yeah,
is how we used to do things long enough ago. Theoretically, most web platforms, you could manage the rest all in that application. I mean, it could
yeah,
go right back to wherever you're storing this data and go retrieve it when it needs to, and all the logic would be in there. But generally speaking, I think we avoid that now, and for a couple good reasons. One is because it's much easier to write these kind of middleware, or what we often refer to as like backend services. It's a very common term, but then you think of what is the backend? It becomes a pretty ubiquitous term. So it is very common to expose something like a web API to go and do the actual work of, okay, this is the thing that's going to interact behind the scenes. Oftentimes we just think of like, it's going to talk to the database, but I'm trying to be a little more generic, because this is probably what's going to do more. In fact, you can make the argument that many times in architectural designs, the web API is really the application, and depending on how you try to structure it, and the front end just is like, I know how to talk to this thing so that I can show things to people, and I can answer their questions, or I can take their requests, but I'm always going back to the back end, and it's doing the real thing, whether it's just as simple as interacting with data, or is it also is there more that it's orchestrating? Somebody signs up. So when it signs up, sure, there might be some that's being added to your specific data store, but is it also, and I'm not saying this is what it would really do, but is it also orchestrating with yet another service? For example, like we talked about emailing. I'm not saying this is what we would do. I actually have no idea, but the process of emailing to large groups has changed, where it used to be easy enough that we quite literally would just have our apps do it. But in the age of junk mail and junk filters, and having to send out thousands of these things, you might really be orchestrating working with yet another service. So we know there's data storage, and we also know there's notification management. I don't know what that is yet, but it's a generic way of saying we might email people, we might send out other types of push notifications.
Yep, good point. So all I'm doing here is I kind of broke that out into just so we have some things we can kind of move around without having to see me and my chicken scratch on the with a pen writing this way. On the big whiteboards in the office, it's much easier, and we certainly can do it here. But the idea is that we have some kind of things that we can kind of drag around. So we know that our it's fine. We know that our web front end is going to have to talk to our API, which will talk to our data store. This service here under notification management, is that something that happens on some kind of a recurring schedule? Right. So it's kind of, hey, are there any notifications for me? Okay, I'm going to run with it. Right. Or is it really almost like a pub sub kind of thing where, hey, here's this thing, go make it happen. Right. So there's some decisions and choices that we can make around what notification management means. And do we got to cover both, or just, mainly predominantly say we're just going to cover one? And then I think data storage, when we think about, we haven't, so spot on with everything you were saying around all those pieces, right? Because we could now also do something where we also include just what we talked about here. Maybe it's not this, maybe this is mobile, right?
Right.
And we still have that as a way of, we can then reuse those APIs because they're not wrapped up inside of that application that we built. They're available for anybody to access. So all cool. When we think about data storage and the data that we have, how do you think about the structure of that data? I mean, typically when we think about this, we wind up having a conversation, or our history kind of puts us in the mind frame of, well, it's SQL, it's the relational data that we've got to have. And is this really a relational problem? Or because we're thinking about moving this into the cloud, we've got other services that we can bring to bear. And, maybe it is relational, or maybe it is like a no SQL kind of environment.
And I was actually wondering if this was the next step to think about, was because it's very easy, especially probably the more gray hair you have, to realize you can solve so many problems with a SQL database, because that's what we did for so long.
Right.
Even if the problem was non-relational, I think, an RDBMS expert, somebody, a good database developer might say like, well, that's whatever. I can still solve the problem relationally. It's no big deal. However, when you think about, and I was thinking about this a little bit before we met, was saying, what's the relationship between one event and another, other than their ordering, maybe? Because, and that's not really a relationship, but just that I'm probably going to want these things to be spit out in a certain order, because most of the time as human beings, we might want to see what the next thing is first.
Mm-hmm.
Or if we're viewing a past timeline, we probably want to see the most recent first. But that's not a relational problem. That's ordering of data, which...
Right. That's the view.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just...
Go back to...
So if I were to store an event, its description, its title, when it takes place, and so on, you might want a common structure, so that way, as the front end view, you can look at this thing and you can pull the stuff out and fill out your web page or your mobile app page or whatever. But I didn't use the word relationship there. I just said you want a structure, and that's
right.
precisely what you can get out of other solutions that aren't relational. So far, I haven't come up with a relationship between events, or even events and speakers, really. I mean, just not to this point. I hadn't come up with one. So that would be interesting to try something that might be very different for a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. And so let's just take a little bit of a sidebar, right? And when we think about what data might be, right? So we might have, something that is, think of this as our tables, right? So we might have a table of the individual events, and we might have a table that is all of the members, everybody who has signed up to be part of this group, right? And then we might have, as we schedule those events, we might have another table that is the union of events underscore attendees. Well, that's terrible. Right. So typical, classic relational database architecture, right? And if I want to have something that shows me, a view that basically says, show me tonight's event and all of the information around it. So I've got to have joined between this table and the information in this table, because I want, a part of that event is who's attending. So I want to make sure I include all of that in there, so that query gets a little bit, it's not challenging at this stage, because it's, the app is kind of small. But do I need to make that kind of a query, include some kind of a think about, it's not just the, data that we have here is two pieces. It's the storage of the data, and it's the compute associated with the data. So now I've got to have some engine that understands how to do that compute for that query and gives me that back. So yes, Postgres could probably handle something like that. SQL could handle something in MySQL. You've got those different kind of relational constructs that can do that. But what if I could just say, this event has an event ID on it, and I just need to go and get a document that has all the information about my event here, and included in there is a big JSON structure that includes all of the information about the event, like we have in the first table, but it would also have an attendee section.
Right. Like it's very possible that you just write the attendees right to this, instead of doing what we typically do relationally, which is say, okay, now I'm going to join up the attendees and the event. And you might even have you probably would have like a junction table, right, where the events and the attendees are and all you're doing is just storing a bunch of IDs, and then you have this really nice query. But do you
Yep.
need that? And you have to ask, what does
Right.
that buy you? So,
so, and this, again, this is a small application, so it
yeah,
may,
sure.
the overhead around that, but what you get there is that speed of writing and the speed of reading out of your data set, because it's basically, here's the event that I want to go get, and then
Yep.
go ahead and just basically call into that doc.
Oh,
And
right.
then
So
that,
when I said, what does it buy you? I'm thinking about the relational aspect, because here, I think what you're
yeah,
proposing, and I was thinking about too, is it really that much different from just as an attendee says, I'm going to go to this, that they're just put right into this structure so that way your read is super fast.
exactly. Now,
Yeah.
there are other ways to do that, right? There's
Yep.
GraphQL, which lets
Yep.
us go ahead and say, create the structure for me. When I make a request, here's the structure and the relationships that I want you, and the relationships between the tables I want you to pull together in this one request, so that it all comes back to me in a similar manner. That's could be something else to explore, right? If we wanted to go the relational way, but I don't see us do a ton of reporting, like cross event reporting. And even if we did, maybe we have one of the documents that is all the events we did, broken down by calendar year. This way we don't have to query each one of them to say, here is here's all the events we did in 2024. Maybe we just have a document that includes that data.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like, because I was thinking this a lot about how if this was just a much simpler, um, a simpler system, that maybe you don't have to do some of the common things that we think about setting up. You'd have like, it wouldn't really be an attendees table now, probably your members table and your events table, and then another table where you're combining events and members, and you're saying, look, these members have signed up to go to this event. And then what that does buy you, though, I would say, when I think about what is the relational database buy you, is it easier? I'm not going to say that it's not possible, but what becomes easier is that if an attendee signs up for an event, and then later, or a member signs up for an event, and then later changes some of their own details, such as their profile pic or their email address, then you sort of get for free that update the next time somebody goes to the page, and you're just basically joining up. Well, I know that these particular members are coming to this event. Now let me have the query that joins up the member information. You get that update, quote unquote, for free.
Right.
Just the question is it worth it? So
that is interesting, right? Because there's, there would be a similar document in the data store for each attendee, or for each, attendee well, at that stage, they're just members of the group.
Yeah, right. Because we've been calling them attendees, but then you kind of take a step back and think, aren't they just members?
Yeah.
Unless we want to allow the anonymous attendee who says, like, listen, I'm just going to give you my email address, but I'm not going to sign up for this thing. That's a different feature that we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah. Right. How much, yeah. How, and some of that is, yeah, definitely. Let's put a pin in that one.
Yep.
But in here, right, I have all of the members' information, like you said, picture and things of that nature. But I also might have the events that
right. What have they been to?
Right.
Yeah.
So just by going to, much like we gather, cool. I have this. There we go. So much like I have this here, that is all the information about an event that I can query and pull that together. I could do the same thing here around the member and be able to relatively quickly get that back. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, this is really the whole, I mean, it didn't take very long for us to get to the core of the NoSQL versus SQL type debate, which I'm really simplifying when I say that. I'm
Oh,
really
totally,
simplifying.
totally, we are.
Right. It doesn't take long to get there because, and I'm curious if these kind of discussions happen in when you're talking with customers, because especially if you have someone in the conversation who has a long history with a relational database, which look, that's me. I do.
Mhm.
I've had a long history with it. So I immediately start breaking these problems down because you've done it for so long. So you start breaking them down
Right.
relationally and say, yeah, I mean, look, I get it. This data is mostly it's not really all that relational. Oh, but here's a use case where it sure would be nice because I'll go update the member's information and boom, the next read just works. But I think what happens is someone like that, or even me, hasn't stopped yet to think about scale.
Sure.
And again, we don't,
Exactly.
what's the target scale for this? If your target scale is, social media giant,
Mhm.
now your read has to be so incredibly fast that,
And
or
you're
at least
right.
you want it to be fast and performant,
Yeah.
that you're going to destroy a relational database trying to say, okay, every time one of our millions of users comes here, you got to go perform 2 or 3 joins. Forget it,
Right.
right?
Yeah, totally. And so the read writes being quick and efficient is, kind of pushes you in this direction. Is our app ever going to get that big where it needs to? Probably not. But I think we can handle that on um, the scaling of a NoSQL database so that it would not be super expensive and possibly even free, because we're not going to have a ton of data. We're not having a lot of transactions. And we can kind of throttle those transactions back to, I think, a reasonable state where we could be in that free tier. So that's one avenue I'm kind of looking at this in, lens I'm looking at this in as well.
Yeah.
The other side, when you think about the SQL NoSQL thing, is oftentimes those SQL or NoSQL instances give you the ability to replicate your data across around the world, essentially in a extremely quick and performant time, such that when I write data here in the US, it can almost instantly be available around the world, right? Now, there are trade-offs in consistency level when you think about that, right? We talk about, from the database perspective, we think about eventual consistency. And I'm not a data guy, so there's like 4 different ways of the consistency, if I remember right. But these are some of the trade-offs you have, because, hey, we need to be able to capture information very quickly or spit out information very quickly for those who request it. Whereas on the SQL side, you typically have a main database that you write to, and then you replicate that out around the world, so that, or you have some kind of an eventing structure in front of it where we write to an event log, and that event log has a process that makes sure it updates all the databases around the world.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So there's a couple different ways of doing it. So
Okay.
we don't. Do you have a? I have something I'd like us try and lean and try into, but I'm curious if you have a preference which way you're thinking of going, whether it's the table side or the NoSQL side.
I don't really. And um I'm interested in trying something that may be new to me for sure.
Okay.
And like I said, I don't see a strong correlation. Like, sure, you know, it's easy for me to start breaking this down and say, like, well, events have members that are coming, and then the member changes something. So does that mean I have to have some way to update the event? And oh, but in a relational database, it just happens. In some respects, you
Right.
could say it just happens because the next join is going to solve my problem. Um, but then it puts you in the place of every time you want to see the latest data, you're doing a join. And that sounds, I mean, look, relational databases are super fast, SQL Server is super fast, but as you
Yeah.
scale, you get to a point, which I have seen,
Mm-hmm.
where you start to realize that not being able to just pull the data either as a ready to read object, or even maybe ready to cache, which is even better, it becomes it becomes a real obstacle.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're talking about here, I don't think we would never hit any of those constraints on either side, on the NoSQL side or on the relational side.
Yeah.
But I think those are part of the conversation that you should walk through as you start to design this out. So you're thinking about it, the questions you're asking, you're thinking about it the right way. So cool.
All right.
So if we go back to where we started to draw out here, as I try and figure out where my mouse ended up. There it is. Boop. All right. So it sounds like we're thinking of going this way to try something different, to try and try and see if there are things we can take advantage of that are in that that kind of a service. So that's cool. I think we've got, so if we think about if we just look at what we've got here, because I'm trying to balance what we've got, we've got like 10 or 15 minutes left, and we're kind of, we at least have some rough idea of pieces. There are some options that we can also talk about with the web front end component, right? So maybe we can essentially, there's, let's just put this out first, right? Do we want this to reside inside of a container, right? That's one thing. Do we want this to be something like, and I'm going to, become a little opinionated here because we're starting to get down the path of, hey, this is, we're going to put in Azure. That's fine. But let's figure out what the, let me move this. Okay. Yeah, that's cool. Wow. Hang on. And this is where I get myself in trouble. Let's undo that. Let's undo that. There we go. Maybe I will just try and move this. Perfect. Okay.
So I think some people probably don't know this, but you do, I think, Rich, is that many years ago, I was working on a whiteboard app.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. And a lot of the things that you're dealing with were issues that we tried to solve. Now, this app didn't ship, unfortunately. Look, a lot of us who've done this a long time have worked on things that didn't end up going anywhere. But a lot of these problems we tried to solve by being able to, and we were doing this this was before there was ever something like a Surface Hub, but it was still a large touchscreen. You could grab elements and you could move them and you could shrink them very quickly. And the idea was we were trying to imagine what problems exist on physical whiteboards. And one of them, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you, is that you're using a physical whiteboard, you think it's great. And then you start making a list in some corner, but you run out of room because you've run into something else you've drawn.
Yeah.
So and you can do this with the Microsoft whiteboard, but we were actually actively trying to solve this problem back then of like, oh, I need more space in this corner. So let me just grab the thing I drew and move it out of the way for a second, expand this a little bit. And actually, I drew this really big. It doesn't have to be that big. Let me shrink it just for a moment, and then I'll put it back. And if we have to look at it later, I can move it out, make it bigger. I know you can do all these things in here, but it turns out some of the first things that I look for in these apps now is how to do that stuff, because we were trying to solve that same problem. Like even that arrow you just erased, we would have grabbed it, turned it, and expanded it to make it, instead of redrawing it. Yeah, to make it match. But you can do all that stuff now. But it was funny that we were like, I would tell you, we were thinking very much about the day-to-day productivity. And unfortunately, it was fun. It was fun. And we were also using the updates were being done with SignalR, and we had both a desktop and a web app at the same time. And it was really cool.
Very cool. I think
so anyways, it's like, you mentioned static web apps, which is interesting, right? Because then like
I was going to go in a different direction.
Oh, okay, okay.
But yeah, we'll come back. So I did want to bring this up because this is something I know we have a lot of people, and this is pretty cool because
Yeah,
Chris and I have been the last couple of months been tough for us to get a show going, and
yeah.
these are one of this video in particular is one that people have continued to watch on a routine basis, pretty much on our website. And that middle-aged life gives us a little bit of a comment here around that Entra ID video you made some time ago.
Yeah, no, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the comment. You know, the reason that we made it was that very specifically, I remember on shows we were trying to enable the different uh, authorization providers, and for whatever reason, Entra ID like it just didn't quite work for me personally. And I said, well, why? And so I did a little bit of digging and ended up producing that video, and really hope that it's helping people. You know, I'm always wondering if we have explained something enough that you can go to work. Like really, the goal of this show, one of the big driving points, if we had a mission statement out there, one of the big bullet points is doing the things that you have to go to work and do every day. It's huge for me to say, you know what? I bet you there are people around the world struggling with how to do this at work right now. And for me, I kept thinking about that internal app. And I don't know that this is the exact solution, but what about that internal application? You already have Active Directory or Azure Active Directory or now Entra ID. You already have that at work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you really want to build another authentication system, or just like, let me just use that? Oh, but wait a second. How do I make this work for my single tenant use case? You know? So I'm really glad it helped. That is so great. And I'm really glad that you joined us to comment on that, because I'll tell you what, that's really motivating, and I'm really happy to hear it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for the comment. That's awesome. Cool. And yeah, so you were talking about, so you were going to ask about static web apps.
No, I just thought like you were listing out the different.
Yeah.
And I think if we're talking about Azure, I think, you know, you've kind of mentioned them, and even containers can be broken a little bit into the different container-based services, but that's fine, right? Like,
right.
Because there's multiple ways. Heck, you could deploy a container into app service too. But that's not the point. That's not the point, right?
It's not really a deployment choice, right? Containers is a little bit of a development choice.
Yeah, right. Like you could say, in fact, I did this. It's been a little while, and I don't know that it's as relevant as it used to be, but there was a time when I would strive to have the solution with just a simple switch, and simple switch hit build, and it builds the Linux container or it builds a Windows container. Right. And part of that was, this was pretty early days. I'm not sure that we had Docker Desktop yet. And I'm not sure we had some of the other tooling that makes it easier to be like WSO and so on, that makes it easier to stay on the Windows platform and still develop a Linux container. I'm not sure that we had, I think it was that long enough ago that basically what I was shooting for at the time was, I want to be able to put my solution in source control, open up a Linux desktop, development desktop, and just go to work. I wanted everything to just work. But I don't know that that's as relevant as it used to be. The reality is, though, we can still set up our environment where the target output is a container. Right. Maybe it goes into a registry, and then these various services can pull it down, whether it's app service, Azure Container Apps. I'm assuming even container service and Kubernetes service, all. So you're right when you say that a little bit of one is the service and the other is the deployment model, where static web apps is certainly, you're making a choice, a development choice.
Kind of at that point.
Yeah, you're making a development choice where it's all going to be front end, essentially.
Yes. Or it's and this is unique, I guess, to the Blazor side, it's Blazor WebAssembly.
Yeah, which is
which
still
technically
happening in your
front end,
browser.
yeah, it comes down to the client. Yeah,
Right.
true. Okay.
So what's the difference between that and choosing app service or choosing containers? Well, the latter two are server deployments, some
Mm-hmm.
server. So you can, and if it helps you, or even if you just like it better, you can have code that runs on that web server. It can be a little bit more than just, okay, I'm just a front end and all I can do is call a web API of some kind or some back end service. That's all I can do.
Right.
Unless I want to compute it here on the client, which good and bad. Computing
Mm-hmm.
on the client is good until whatever it is you're computing on the client might be proprietary in some way. Now you better not do that on the client anymore. So that's the only difference I see is like, okay, do we want to deploy this? Because I even think we could probably set up the development solution in a way that if we really, really wanted to, it could deploy out to many of the server side models. I'm not saying there's
Yeah.
usefulness in that. I'm not trying to say like that's what you want to do at work. But for the purposes of learning, it would be interesting to be like, okay, we have the one project and it's sitting in a repository. And when we push this button, it goes to an app service. And we push this button, it goes to containers. I'm not trying to say that that's usefulness at work. It's just more of like, we showed we can do all these different things.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, yes, I agree with everything you kind of laid out there. So saying containers doesn't necessarily, because there's, I think, there's probably almost a half dozen different ways that we could throw in that container. But it gives the option of flexibility to your IT staff for how they want to deploy it. Right.
Yeah.
I don't have to re-engineer my application if I say, hey, we're rallying around Azure Container Apps for this application.
Yeah. And you can technically write server-side code, which is not the same thing as saying Blazor server. I'm not saying that. You could still be Blazor WebAssembly 100% in an app service or server-based app, but then the Blazor WebAssembly might make calls directly to your locally hosted service, which there are advantages to before it goes back to a backend. That's kind of like, maybe like a backend for front end. A front end for backends type scenario. I said that backwards. Where when you say static web apps, you are not just, this is not just a deployment choice. This is a development choice too. These are
True.
web pages or web assets that are going to be read by the client and then in some sense activated on the client. So whether that was using a modern JavaScript framework or I don't, just some JavaScript framework like say React, I'll just pick on one.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
That comes down to the browser. The browser runs that. Same thing with Blazor WebAssembly. That's happening there too.
Right. And then, and I guess to piggyback on your previous point, yes, you could run Blazor WebAssembly in an app service.
Yep.
The question is, well, what does that buy you then? Because there's a compute engine in an app service, but you're not really taking advantage of it because nothing's computing. We're just basically serving up pages.
Right.
So maybe that's enough and we downgrade, we don't need a high-end bunch of compute to do that, but it's something to consider when you think about, well, I'm building it this way. What's the right place for it? And you may hit limitations and static web apps won't work for you for one reason or another in your application model. So then, okay, now I kind of have to go back to app service, even though it is a static web app with a WebAssembly piece on it. So it's just a matter of talking out and thinking through those design decisions. I think the cool thing about static web apps, when we think about, well, what's the what is that API component that we get to take advantage of? We can do things like
sure.
Static web apps gives the ability to go ahead and talk basically to functions, right? So we can it's got things wired up so that it gets rid of the core the cores or the um, the cross-domain reference
CORS
between your
issues,
web
yeah.
application and the backend service. So we get rid of those issues. The deployment model is there when we think about, pushing this out via CI/CD in whatever DevOps service we want to use. So it does make it easy to use functions as that backend API, but not exclusively, right? Especially if we say this Blazor WebAssembly, we could have that call into, whatever service we want, which gets us back into, well, is this really, are we back to an app service here? Or are we taking advantage of, because of some of the other capabilities we might want to expand into? Do we do some kind of container orchestration service like Azure Container Apps or Azure Kubernetes Service to manage those? I think for this application, that's a lot of overhead to manage, but it is also something that we could explore because there are things that we might be able to take advantage of on the ACA side, especially when we think about, are we going to do this through Aspire? Aspire right now natively will want to deploy things into, they're the easiest way to, the hooks are there inside of Aspire for doing things to container apps, at least right
Okay.
now. They're
Okay.
they're working on additional ones.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even we have to go back and look, but I think there are some other services that are going to be part of Aspire in the .NET 9 timeframe.
Okay.
We can do function-like capabilities where we say our container app, we can say the minimum number of containers I'm running is 0. So if there's no work for it, that container can shut down, much like a function does, and only be up and running at the point in time when we need it. So that's when we think about cost, it's storage, but it's also compute that we're interested in. So having that container be able to be go to sleep essentially, and only be up and running when it's needed can be something of interest. So there are a couple of deployment options when we think about the API side as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it'll be interesting because I don't have a lot of experience. When I say static web apps, I don't just mean the service. I also mean in general the concept of I'm just going to put web assets out there to be read by a browser and it's just going to work. I make that sound magical, but that's kind of what static web apps is. I don't want to call it serverless, but there is no server compute delivering you or rendering a page and delivering you the resultant HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And there's also no, when a request comes in, let me do a little bit of compute first before I go do something else, which is a very common scenario. I think it's almost an easy thing for developers to reach for when you're server side, which in the ASP.NET Blazor world means Blazor server or interactive server, interactive auto. It even means the SSR, the static rendering, which is the default of Blazor now.
Right.
I don't have as much experience there, so the things that jump to mind is me wanting to see how does that work with authentication authorization. Is it still possible to use cookies? Is it not? Because a very common pattern that I use a lot is that even the front end makes quasi backend calls. You've seen me do it on the show, quasi backend calls to localhost.
Yeah.
And now I can take advantage of a cookie there, and there's no CORS concerns. And it's kind of a way to hide away things from, it's an attempt to hide things away from possible prying unauthorized eyes.
Yeah.
Granted, it relies on your user using a commonly accepted browser that hasn't been, there isn't some piece of malware in. Because of course somebody that does their own browsing can read the cookie, of course, but then I make a presumption. Well, if they were a valid user because they proved who they were with username, password, or whatever those pieces are, and even 2FA, well, then do I care if they're perusing through the cookie because they proved who they said they were? It's the person who has malware on the machine that I don't want to be able to open up the cookie with JavaScript or something like that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think about that stuff a lot. That doesn't mean that there aren't solutions that I'm just not familiar with yet. Like they're just not top of mind day to day. There's a lot in this world. And even though I feel like, yeah, I do a lot of building of web applications, but there's lots of different ways to do the same thing. And there's plenty of things that I've just haven't really jumped into. So that would be interesting to try.
Okay. So I'm hearing then, if we go back to, so what I'm hearing then is that we're thinking, if we think about the last two pieces of decisions that, at least for initially, we have to make, right? We're thinking about static web apps and functions, since they go well together with essentially using, was it WASM? WebAssembly as the place where the compute runs.
Yeah, it would be the version, the interactivity of Blazor that I use the least. so in some respects,
that's why we do this.
Yeah, right. In some respects, it's kind of fun because it's like, no, I usually don't reach for this. So
okay. So we're gonna say, so just we're gonna go this. We're gonna go this. We've already got our NoSQL figured out. Do we need to? We didn't really make a decision on an authentication engine, right? Where are we doing our authentication bits?
Yeah,
and we can save that for. I have time until 9:30 if you want to keep going.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, I don't. I've been okay being a little over, but I can't be.
Yeah, you gotta get out.
Over. So, because like we always say, it's the show before stand up. Well, it really is the show before stand up. So, absolutely true. Here on the U.S. East Coast. So, but definitely, thinking about that, I always think there's two types of users. It's when you're building the internal app, I want to link up to an internal registry. When I'm building an external app, now I'm less interested in wanting. I'm not totally against, but less interested in wanting to manage all of that. And I think if you've watched this show, you know that I love reaching for external authentication providers.
Yeah.
Maybe that's okay. Maybe that's okay, because the only people that you're missing out on are the people who say, oh, but the email address that I love and adore is not one of the common providers, right?
Yep. And we don't have that problem with this user.
Yeah.
Group.
Yeah.
So I think we'll be fine saying, hey, yeah, we're going to do authentication. We're going to use some external identity provider, and TBD who that is, what that is, how many of them there are when we get to that point.
Right. I mean, some interesting things about that there is we talked about earlier, and this is just an aside, we talked about the attendee that doesn't really want to go through the massive sign up process, but they're just like, yeah, sure, I'm fine giving you my email so you know I'm coming. In some respects, you could almost argue, well, you are a member, you're just a member that hasn't really filled out your profile, because you don't even need a password or anything. The next time you come back and you say, hey, here's who I am, we say, well, you don't have a password or authentication mechanism with us, so we're going to send you an email. The magic link has become much more common. I'm seeing more and more services reach for it. Yeah. And it is a little refreshing to just, except for sometimes the delay in waiting for the email. It can be quick, it can be slow, but it's a little refreshing to not add yet another password to your password management tool, or ask yourself, because this happens to me, which external authentication did I use for this? Did I use this one or that one? Because if I click the wrong one, am I creating a second user? So anyways, but certainly like early Dev says, and I'm willing to concede this. I'm going to show this comment. Magic links are annoying in some circumstances. I agree with that. And I'll just leave it up there. I agree. And one of the circumstances, I'd be curious what some of the other ones are, is sometimes that email just doesn't show up. That's frustrating.
Yeah. And then you're doing it again.
Yeah. Then you do it again. And then eventually about 2 hours later, 5 of them come across. Um, if it's a real good seamless experience, especially with a mobile app, it can be nice. Sometimes,
Hmm.
though, I feel like the loop wasn't closed. And so the app sends an email. The email link takes you to the web version of the site on your device, which could be okay, except that it might be a disconnected experience because you were in the middle of something.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, like, here's a good
Comments
example,
there.
right? Here's a good
Yeah.
example. Imagine my company provides me a link to a service that I want to access out of hours on my own equipment. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And that's where, so when we talk about my company on this show, and it goes a little bit back to what the comment we got earlier, is that I've been a big fan of like, well, let's integrate, if possible to our own internal directory to streamline
Hmm.
that. But now the question arises, am I allowed to log into that on my own equipment? And some places the answer is yes. Some places it's a no.
Right.
You know, it just depends. Um,
Hmm.
there are certainly places I've worked at that if you're not on the VPN, you're out. And then there's other
Yeah.
places that say, well, some limited services you could log into on a different web browser. We're going to let that happen, but only in certain limited cases. So, oh, haha, forgot about the brand.
No, that
That's
was me.
okay.
I was trying to
No, you did
produce a
fine.
little bit here, and
You did fine. Okay, so we have a direction, and there's
yeah.
things we can get started on, including, including um, we've talked a lot about on this show, like what to do first. And I
Hmm.
think you've probably gotten different answers depending on which show you watched, like, getting the authentication authorization right, getting the deployment right, just go ahead
Right.
and getting that set up right away so that even though it's hello world, it's going out to your targets. So
Hmm.
that'll be
Hmm.
interesting to see what we tackle next, because I
Yeah.
don't presume to have that
Let's
answer right now.
let us know in the comments what you think is how you
Yeah.
typically do it, right? Because if we get enough comments, maybe we'll take a direction from the folks here who are watching. So
Yeah. No, absolutely. And definitely appreciate the comments. The folks who joined us today, really appreciate it, and great points, by the way. Like, really
hmm.
annoying if there's a service you want to use off hours that maybe isn't even directly related to your company, which is the point that we just got at the very end here from Surly Dev, is like, hey, maybe work's providing you Udemy access. Yeah, in fact,
Right.
yeah, I that's happened. So I absolutely correct use case there, right? And then if the magic link takes you back to your work email, well, there goes the whole convenience, right? So definitely, I get it. All right, well, it's 9:12. I
Yeah.
have just enough time to maybe refill a cup of coffee and then get to my stand up. Rich, this was great. Thank you for
Yeah.
walking
This
us
is
through a
fun.
lot of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Is this the type of thing you like to see? It's a little different for us. We haven't done a whiteboard session in quite a while, so great to do that. And yeah, we're gonna start off next week, hopefully on Monday. At least that's where trying to keep. I'd like to get in the cadence of a Monday and a Friday, and I
Yep.
think we can kind of do that until we hit the holidays, and then everything's
Yeah.
out of the
We'll
mix.
see what happens.
So we'll try and do that. So hopefully we'll see you back here Monday. And for Chris Gomez, I am Rich Ross. We will sign off from the Dev Talk Show. Thanks.